We will work with total determination and with utter firmness to ensure that the voice of the Ulster majority is heard loud and clear throughout the land.
For children growing up in Northern Ireland in the late 20th century, violence was an ordinary neighborhood affair. A war of the most erratic, intransigent nature had taken over the island, the culmination of decades of violence and centuries of discord that cultivated a divided society along humans' favorite debates: faith and politics. Arising through stark religious division, political discourse, and centuries of conflict with the British Empire, the Northern Ireland conflict displayed cyclical debate and diplomacy throughout its decades of ethno-sectarian warfare. The damage inflicted upon Irish society was not undone by a divided island or internationally collaborative diplomacy. Deep scars on Ireland's national identity and social fabric will persist so long as the sectarian divide remains. Following the 12th century Norman invasion, Ireland was left vulnerable to centuries of conquest movements from English nobles fighting to drive out native Gaelic culture. They found most success in Ulster, the northern province that became culturally distinct from the southern island. Simultaneously, Europe was experiencing dramatic religious change with the spread of the Protestant Reformation. The southern majority of Ireland held on to Catholicism, resisting England's shifts away from fundamental Catholic authority. The Northern Ireland conflict is modernly characterized by the stark separation of Catholics and Protestants, yet more important than their specific faiths were the united communities that formed along religious lines. The group's shared cultural experiences united them, such that the motivation behind the conflict falls on religion as an ethnic identity rather than a doctrine of worship and theology. The famine of 1845 to 1851 impacted the Irish-British relationship, particularly for Irish nationalists who saw it as an engineered genocide. The period of lethal deprivation devastated Ireland's native culture, especially as speaking the Gaelic language was a form of resisting colonization. This made Ireland vulnerable to British authority, establishing a villain in the Irish story and the Empire's tyrannical reputation. Due to the patterns of English invasion and settlement, the nationalist population was largely congregated in the south, while those in Ulster favored the Empire. So began the first major debates of the Northern Ireland conflict: Catholic nationalists clashing with Protestant loyalists over ownership and governance of Ireland. The nationalist movement began with a political campaign to strengthen Irish autonomy with a domestic parliament in Dublin. This concept of home rule challenged traditional imperial authority. From 1886 to 1912, Westminster Parliament debated the bill, while loyalists used propaganda to express their opposition, arguing that self-governance would bring chaos to Northern Ireland. Home rule finally passed in 1914, but World War I impeded its implementation. On April 24, 1916, in the Easter Rising, nationalist rebels took matters into their own hands, claiming pride in their Irish identity in an independence proclamation reading, "In the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, we declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland." The rebels overtook Dublin streets in a week that left 485 dead. After their surrender on April 29th, rebel leaders who were executed by British officials became martyrs in the nationalist movement, swaying the public agenda. Those who had supported Home Rule and the moderate Irish Parliamentary Party came to support the radical ideas of Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin overtook Ireland's representation in Westminster Parliament, giving the nationalist movement a political platform. Tensions grew as the Irish Republican Army, an organized militia executing Sinn Féin's political campaign, shot members of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. Though the British government attempted to control the conflict diplomatically, the new Irish Parliament declared a war of independence in 1919. It was at once a consequence of ineffective diplomacy and a physical escalation of political debates. The war reached its climax on Bloody Sunday in November of 1920, after which violent retaliation from Irish rebels surged to overpower British forces. Britain's management of Ireland had failed. Another diplomatic attempt followed the ceasefire. In early December 1921, representatives signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty to radically restructure Irish government. The treaty partitioned Ireland into Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland with autonomous governments. However, by addressing the island as an ethnic and political whole, it ignored the ongoing debates and murky ideological lines. Northern Ireland included only 6 of 9 Ulster counties, leaving a Protestant minority in the Republic of Ireland. Similarly, some Catholics lived in the north. When Northern Ireland's parliament opted out of the treaty in 1922, returning to British rule, those Catholics were forced back into their old struggles. From 1922 to the 1960s, Northern Ireland's societal stability dwindled. Facing discrimination, gerrymandering, and suppressive voting policies, the Catholic minority organized the Northern Ireland civil rights movement. While decades of violence might have been prevented through reform, peaceful protests became beatings and neighborhoods became battlefields. In 1969, after the very violent Battle of the Bogside, the British military began their longest continuous deployment in history. Operation Banner changed the nature of the conflict and provoked endless riots, car and letter bombings, murders, and explosive attacks in Northern Ireland, and England. The IRA was portrayed as a terrorist group, and because religious identity was intertwined with politics, all Catholic people were villains. Within the nationalist movement, however, those so-called terrorists were revered. Bobby Sands, a prominent nationalist martyr who organized and died from a prison hunger strike in 1981, described his resistance to the alien, oppressive, unwanted regime and said, "Never will they label our liberation struggle as criminal." The British government was not sympathetic to their movement.
Crime is crime is crime. It is not political, it is crime.
In 1973, another attempt at diplomacy was made. The power-sharing Sunningdale Agreement gave the Irish Republic an advisory role in Northern Ireland. Though officials were eager to forge peace, loyalists responded by bombing Catholic communities across the island. They created new cycles of terror, killing civilians and collapsing the Sunningdale Agreement. Yet again, Ireland's fierce debates and ethnic divide had overpowered diplomacy. Finally, after over 3,500 deaths during Operation Banner and irrevocable cultural damage, the islands found more sustainable stability. In the conflict's most significant case of diplomacy, American Senator George Mitchell worked under President Clinton to chair negotiations between Irish, Northern Irish, and British leaders. After the IRA ceasefire in 1995, newly idle citizens began to rebuild Northern Ireland's infrastructure as families and communities healed. With the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, Northern Irish people gained Irish citizenship while remaining in the UK. This elaborate process relied on compromise and a common consensus that no future lay in conflict. Still, true peace meant coexisting with those responsible for destruction. In August of 1998, this obstacle showed itself in a violent aftershock. A splinter group of the newly inactive militia executed the cruel Omagh bombing that killed 29 and injured over 200 others. The deadliest accident in the entire conflict, the bombing was a tragic consequence of the combustible tensions that diplomacy left behind. Through the guerrilla nature of the conflict, many rebel forces felt no constricting allegiance with their political affiliations, meaning that tranquility among Sinn Féin and the British government didn't translate into harmony among sectarian groups. This harmony is still largely missing today. After the Omagh bombing, official forces were able to quell the violence and cultivate fragile yet promising peace. However, modern political turmoil is again challenging the stability of Irish-British relations. Britain's exit from the European Union, where the Republic of Ireland remains, complicated matters of trade, dual citizenship, and cross-border travel. Moreover, 56% of Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU to retain its financial support of peace-building and reconciliation. This joins a growing disapproval of British government actions and a rise in street violence in Belfast. As the framework of a divided society in Northern Ireland still exists, some Catholic and Protestant communities are returning to old hostility. Sinn Féin leaders called Brexit the most serious threat in the history of the peace process, reigniting debates despite Irish Prime Minister Micheál Martin's plea not to spiral back to that dark place of sectarian murders and political discord. The Good Friday Agreement stipulates that with London and Ireland's approval, Northern Ireland could rejoin the Anglo-Irish Treaty to form a united island. This prospect threatens to destroy decades of intricate, precious diplomacy, uncover old feuds, and claim many new lives. In this position, Northern Ireland demonstrates the insurmountable nature of political discourse, when bound to ethnic groups and rooted in centuries of trauma and mistrust.